Hey everybody, it's Dan. Welcome back to another painting video. This time it's going to be for the Cannon Fodder from Wargames Atlantic that I reviewed a little earlier this month. And because I didn't have a project in mind, I decided I'm going to paint these up 5 different ways just to see what we can achieve with these figures. And in all cases, they're going to be in my Razzle Dazzle style, which, if you're not familiar with that, it's going to involve blocking out thinned down colors. You can see me mixing up some in the background there. That's what I'm doing with all but the metallics, is mixing in almost 50-50 Vallejo thinning medium with paint, which creates almost like a contrast paint base here. So I'm going to apply that, block out all the colors, do a light dry brush of just usually pure white, and then a heavy wash at the end. And the end result ends up looking something like a, I think, like gritty version of slap chop. So that's what I'm doing here. So we'll kind of procedurally, we'll go through and we'll block out colors on each of these 5 color schemes. And then toward the end of the video, I'll bring them all back together to do those dry brush and wash stages all at the same time. So we blocked out colors here. This is a Penal Legion, kind of a classic Imperial Guard theme that I think Wargames Atlantic had mostly in mind when they designed this Cannon Fodder kit. So I figured it'd be an appropriate place to start. So that orange jumpsuit, you can really see the watered down nature of the paint, kind of how it behaves, similar to a contrast paint. Doing the same thing here with the skin tone, kind of a pallid skin tone from P3 that I don't actually think they make anymore. But otherwise, the weapon we painted silver. It said lead belcher, but I think that was actually bolt gun metal. But otherwise, it's just a nice dark silver color. And then the boots and the casing for the gun are going to need to paint it in a Baden black. And that's pretty much it for this figure. And in all cases, actually, I stuck to, I think, a pretty reserved palette. There's only 4 paints on this figure. And I think at most on one of the schemes I used 6, which is unusual for me. Usually I'm painting like Dark Age and medieval figures that are using lots and lots of different colors. So I wanted to keep these as simple and approachable as I could. But there you go. So here's the finished model, and as I said, we're going to move on to the next one, and then we'll bring them back at the end for the detail bits. So for this one, I had originally envisioned him as like an astronaut, like a downed pilot, but I realized too that they vaguely look like the Sardaukar from the movie adaptation of Dune, the more recent one, that have the white armor. The helmets, I think, stylistically look very similar, except in those cases they were clear, but I'm going to paint this one up to be gold, like an astronaut spacesuit. So anyway, most of this figure is going to be white, so that's what I'm doing. I'm blocking out Corax white over the whole figure. It actually already had a base coat of Corax white. I went through and did a thin coat on all the figures, and I'm just really enhancing that here. This is actually not really thinned down paint because I'm not trying to have the paint go into the recesses because this is white. So I'm just trying to get a nice solid foundation of Corax white over basically the entire figure here. And with that down, I'm moving into painting up the gloves in black. These are actually just hands. But I learned a long time ago that if you just paint hands at the scale in a color like a brown or a black, it looks like gloves at the tabletop level. So that's what I'm doing here, just painting up both hands, and then the boots will also be in a Baden black, which is a fun little trick for you there. So yeah, painting up everything that way. This is slightly thinned down with that Vallejo thinning medium. And then otherwise, the only other details to pick out on this figure, because most of it's going to get picked up at the white dry brush stage, are the gun, which I'm painting in that silver color again, and then the visor, which I had mentioned I wanted to be gold. So this is Retributor armor from Games Workshop. And then I'm going to stencil in where I want the details to be. In the movie, they have these 3 red stripes made from blood on their front of their armor, but because of the zipper location, I couldn't place it there, so I went with the shoulder pads. So I don't know if anybody else watched Stargate as a kid. I did back in the 90s, and I remember thinking that their uniforms looked so cool as a kid. And really, it's like a generic interpretation of, like, I don't know, U.S. Navy SEALs from the 90s, because they have these green jumpsuits, green hats, and a black vest is usually what they're wearing. So that's what I'm going with here. This color is weird. I don't think Vallejo makes this anymore. The closest approximation I could find online was called military green from Vallejo, but the bottle I checked is called U.S. dark green. So that's what I'm using for the uniform that I'm painting up. That's also, you can see, thinned down with that Vallejo thinning medium. And then because of the way they designed these jumpsuits, I think very cleverly, depending on how you paint the torso piece, it can actually look like light body armor, which is what I'm going for here. I'm painting it in black to make it look like a vest, kind of just ignoring the zipper on the front or cutting it across where it goes down into the pant area. And I think it makes a pretty convincing looking vest just from painting it a different color from the uniform. I mentioned the guns are all getting painted the same way, so they're getting the frame painted in black, and then the metal bits are all getting a dark metal color, probably bolt gun metal, not lead belcher. One with a different color here for the skin tone, I'm going with Barbarian Flesh from Army Painter, which is probably my standard skin color if I had to pick just one that I use the most often, but I have a handful that I rotate through just to represent different skin tones. And then that's it. Figure's ready to go for the dry brush stage. And then this guy kind of reminded me of Starship Troopers, and it's funny, I didn't look at any like reference pictures for any of these. I just kind of went with it. I had my headphones in, didn't feel like taking them out, and I just went from memory on what Starship Troopers looked like in the film. And in retrospect, I would have gone with like a more bluish gray color here. This is Eshin Gray from Citadel. Because when I looked at photos after the fact, I found that their armor is a little bit lighter. It's more like a bluish tone. And they did have gray uniforms. This is Ash Gray from Army Painter, which I think is very similar to the old, if anybody remembers, Codex Gray. It was a great color from Citadel back in the early 2000s. This is very similar. And incidentally, I kind of accidentally painted this up to look pretty much like my first Imperial Guard army. I painted like this. It was black Cadian armor and gray jumpsuits, kind of to represent like urban fighters. But again, the intent with this design was I was trying to do Starship Troopers. So going with Barbarian Flesh again for the skin tone, because I still had it handy and ready to go from the last color scheme that we painted. So just going through and painting those up, and then the gun, and that's it. Actually, is the only thing we have left to paint. The boots. Yeah, the boots. You could actually probably have gotten away with painting the gun the same color as the body armor, but because it's so dark. But I think if you were going with like a more bluish gray body armor, you probably should go with a slightly different color for the weapon, just for the contrast. And then, yeah, paint up the metal bits, let it dry, and you're going to be ready for the dry brush step at the end. So there you go. Very, very simple to paint these up. You can see that's 4 colors. And then this is a fun one. This is not from the Cannon Fodder kit, but the bits are. So if anybody remembers back in the very early 2000s, I guess it would have been like 2004, after the 6th edition Bretonians were released, I remember in a White Dwarf, somebody had done what they were calling a feudal world Imperial Guard army, using the Bretonian men-at-arms, the then newly released Bretonian men-at-arms, kit bashed with Cadian shock troops to create a look very similar to this one. And then after that White Dwarf article, I feel like I started seeing variants of that army in like every game store. So I thought I'd take another crack at it with a modern interpretation here, using the bodies from the War Games Atlantic Foot Sergeant's kit, and then the bits are from this Cannon Fodder set, the gun, arms, and the backpack. And you can see they blended together, I think, pretty seamlessly. So I'm painting up I painted the jacket, and Steel Legion Drab did the pants the same way. And I probably would have gone with a different color for the pants, except that I was trying to keep a simple color scheme for all of these. A lot more metal bits on this, because I'm painting up the armor in metal instead of in, well, various other kind of like lacquer-y colors like I was doing on the other figures. Still black and silver on the gun bits. And then other than that, the only other thing I needed to paint was the backpack. So this is Dryad Bark from Citadel. And then the bedroll up on the top is going to be done in, I think, Wolf Gray from the Army Painter, which kind of mirrored what I've seen on the Death Corps of Krieg, what they were doing with that scheme. I think the end result was pretty neat. But yeah, I found this conversion to be pretty convincing as far as I'm concerned, so way to go, War Games Atlantic. So here we go. So now we're progressing into the next stage of the Razzle Dazzle painting style, which is a very light dry brush. I've lost a lot of footage here. This is me coming back in and doing a like supplemental dry brush on this figure in particular, because he's white and I wanted his highlights to be especially bold. So that's what I do. I go through and I lightly dry brush the entire figure in white, and then I come back in with a detail brush, and I'm trying to boost these highlights, especially on this figure, but I do this on all of them. on all the non-metal areas, coming in with that same pure white color. And I'm basically picking out highlights for the prior dry brush stuff. I'm sorry the footage is kind of blurry, but kind of happens when you get very close. Here you can see me doing it on the other figures here too, where I'm going through, I'm using the prior dry brush step as a guide, and I'm essentially highlighting the brightest portions of that dry brush step. And it looks ridiculous at this stage, but once we wash it, those are going to get blended together very nicely from the wash, and they're actually going to get pigmented by the wash. They're not going to be pure white once that wash is applied, but this is going to create a very nice contrast point of brightness that will keep the models looking nice and bright, I think, even though we're going to do a heavy wash here at the end. So going through, picking out on all the bits of armor. Again, the only places I ignore are the metal parts, because we're actually going to highlight that after the wash stage. I found is the best time to do that. But otherwise, absolutely everything is getting a dot of white at some point. And here we go. So this is the heavy wash step. So this actually evolved out of using Army Painter dip. And I found that by just using a heavy wash of some kind of acrylic-based wash, like in this case Agrax Earthshade, you could also use Army Painter Strong Tone, like in the bottles, though it's not the same product, but it has a similar effect. But you're going to just very, very heavily wash the entire figure. And then as you see me starting to do there, you're going to blot away anything that you don't want. And I actually, on this one, took out a bigger brush because I wanted to take so much of it back. But it's important that you wash the whole figure. And this is kind of a bravery test with white models like this, where it's going to alter it pretty substantially from how it looked when it was unwashed. But if you are too reserved here and you leave, certain spots of it unwashed, what you'll end up with are these like really weird looking clean patches that don't blend together nicely with the model. So it's much better to wash the entire thing and then take away whatever you don't want. And especially like where it starts pooling on flat areas in hands, around the feet, you want to make sure that you wick any of that away so that it dries appropriately. But even on models like the white one, like this one with the gray uniform, which I wanted to be slightly brighter, it's better to wash it, and then you can even actually wash the brush that you're using. You can see I'm wicking it away, but I will basically rinse it out so that it's perfectly clean, and then you can take even more of it off of the figure, depending on how bright you want the washed area to be. So let them dry overnight, and then one of my favorite parts of sci-fi figures is the use of transfers. I think that's like the most, other than shields on like medieval figures, I think sci-fi models are especially conducive to transfers. So I'm using, these are all from Forgotten Chapters, which I've did a review for in a prior video. I highly recommend these guys. Again, there's no like affiliate link or anything with them. I just really like this product, and I recommend that you check them out. I'll have a link in the description. So yeah, this is using a couple of the transfers that Forgotten Chapters sent my way for review purposes, and I'm enjoying finding different uses for them. I mentioned highlighting the silver bits after the wash. So again, the wash is dried. I'm coming through, this is Shining Silver from the Army Painter, which is a very, very bright silver color. And you can see I'm almost like edge highlighting with this. It's following a similar pattern to the dot highlights that I talked about with the white paint step. But in this case, it's also sticking to the edges for the most part. And with that done, I'm moving on to eyes. I'm just dotting the eyes in white. And it's a little weird because I'm sticking to colors across multiple models. I went through while I had the white out and boosted up the dry brush on this figure because it got quite dirty with the wash, even with what I wicked away. I wanted to enhance some of the white areas a little bit more. Just again, I think with miniature painting, the name of the game is always contrast, especially when we're talking about things at the tabletop level. So again, while I had the white out, I boosted that up, and then I went a step further here on this white armor because I'm actually, in the end, going to give this a shot of Ard Coat from Citadel, the gloss varnish for the torso and the helmet to give it kind of a shiny appearance, contrasting with the pants and arms there. And then I also went through and where I had stenciled in with Mephiston red, I'm using this is blood red from AK Acrylics to create a nice clean couple of lines there on both the arms for that Sodokar motif. And then I also wanted to do a scar here, and I'm just using, I think, Screamer Pink from Citadel. And I recommend if you do this, what you really should do, I was just feeling lazy, is you should blend in just a little bit of the skin tone that you used and put that down as a base layer. And then what you saw me doing there is using that Rin Flesh, the original skin tone color. Again, I don't know why this ended up so blurry. I think it's just because it's zoomed in so far. And then I applied that as a highlight, and it creates, I think, a pretty convincing looking scar. Do 2 dots for the pupils there in black, and then I'm also coming in with Carroburg Crimson here. And this is a trick that I showed you on my medieval archers, which is that if you put a dot in on the inner part of both eyes, like where it touches the bridge of the nose, and fan it out, it creates kind of like a sickly look to the eyes, and it also mellows out the whiteness of the eye a little bit. I also applied that on the scar there, just give it kind of a reddish tint. And then around the collar there, that explosive collar that these Penal Legion guys wear, to create kind of make it look irritated where the skin is touching the metal. So I did that on this figure in particular. And then once that was all done, all the detail work was finished, I went through, this is Army Painter Matte that I'm painting on all of the figures. So I went through, I did a thin coat of this over everything but the metal. And then once that was dry, I don't have footage of it, but I mentioned I went through on 2 of the figures and I applied Citadel Ard Coat. So it seems counterintuitive, but you want to get it all down to the same point, and then you can boost it back up with a gloss varnish if you choose to do so. So that's what I did with this figure. So here's the Sodokar finish, and you can see that the torso and the helmet are shiny, whereas everything else is not. And I'm pretty pleased with how that turned out. That was probably the fastest of the figures to paint. Here's our Stargate Trooper, all done. Again, the base work, I'll have a separate video on that, but it's really straightforward as well. But yeah, I'm really, really happy with how these turned out, especially given that I think in total, we're talking like maybe an hour and a half of total work across these 5 figures. So especially if you were assembly lining it with a single color scheme, I think it would be even faster in terms of per model output. Here's our Starship Trooper. I thought it was most appropriate for him to have blood effects on him, given how gory parts of that film were. Here's our Penal Legion guy, all finished up. Again, I really recommend a good matte varnish. Army Painter matte is excellent, as is Testor's Dull Coat if you want it in a spray instead of in those dropper bottles. And then I also think this scheme would look pretty well, look good for Krieg, if that's something that you were looking to do. But otherwise, I found that conversion to be pretty convincing. So anyway, so here's all 5 finished models. I'm really happy with how these turned out. I think any one of them would look cool if you painted up a whole unit or even a whole army this way. So anyway, I really appreciate you guys dropping by for this one. And until next time, happy gaming.